So this week, we are discussing the first table, or the first tablet of the Ten Commandments, or, like we talked about last week, the 10 words. Even though these words were probably not written necessarily on a stone tablet, we're going to talk about them even though they were. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, you should have been at church last week. But I can recap for you later if you want. So we talked about how when we're trying to envision these 10 sacred words of God, it is easiest for us to envision them on two separate tables or two separate tablets. The first 4 of those words, what we normally call the commandments, the first 4 of those sacred words deal with God and how we relate to God. The second 6, those that would be on the second table or the second tablet, deal with our neighbors or how we relate to our neighbors. The scripture that Ed read, it comes up in both that story about Jesus and being asked, which is the greatest commandment, comes up in both Gospels of Matthew and Mark. I don't know about y'all, but it's always been confusing for me that Jesus would be asked, which is the greatest commandment? And he would answer by giving them 2 commandments. Does that seem odd to anyone else? He talks about loving God and then loving neighbor. This is the wholeness of the law. First tablet, love God. Second tablet, love neighbor. So when Jesus says the greatest commandment is to love God and then to love neighbor, that is the entirety of the 10 commandments, or these 10 sacred words. Love God, love neighbor. Today we are talking about the first tablet, that first table of the law. The first bit about how to love God, or about our relationship with God. Or to be more exact, it's actually telling us a lot about who God is and about who God is not. So listen again as I read from a smaller print version of the Bible than Ed did. That's right, I'm bragging for now. Of course, it's also my iPad, so I can make it as big as I want. But you don't understand technology, so never mind. Yeah, so hear the words again. These sacred words from God to the people of Israel. But this time, when you listen to them, try and listen to them as they are telling us about who God is and who God is not. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. That one seems pretty easy, right? Pretty straightforward. I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of slavery in Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. Simple. God deserves to be first and foremost. God, who has freed the people from slavery, deserves their first and foremost worship as the one who liberates them. But notice, it's not just God who had freed them from. It's the God who frees you from. God continues to free from slavery. God continues to liberate from slavery. The freeing from slavery is not a one-time event in the life of the people of Israel, nor in any of our lives. God continues to be at work. It's not just a one-time thing that God did. If God had only done that saving thing one time, it would be just fine to put other gods in front of God, to worship other gods who maybe could liberate you from whatever stress or evil or slavery you are in. But that's not who God is. God continues to save and will continue to save into the future. You shall have no other gods before me, because I am the Lord your God who saves you, and will save you. That's who God is. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth. This one's probably a little more tricky for us. Because we don't live in the same day and age as the people of Israel. They lived in a culture and among a people that worship gods made in the forms of idols, either big or small or large. These statues made in the images of these variety of gods that people worship. Those were the idols that God was speaking about in those days. People would try to create a likeness of something like maybe Odin, you might understand that from your Norse mythology, or Baal in that time, in that place, and they would worship those likenesses of God, those false likenesses of false gods. It's not really a challenge for us, right? We don't really go into people's homes and see little shrines built to different little idols and different statues of God all that often. So that seems pretty straightforward, but it gets tricky. Because even though we don't live in a time and a place where people make and sell idols for us to worship, we do live in a time and place where that idol worship sneaks into our lives. It can especially sneak into our lives when we combine it with that one that is before. You shall have no other gods before me. Well, we may not make little idols to worship like gods, but we do live in a culture that values certain things like success, earning our way into a better life and a better world. Well, if we have idols, we don't have to look much further than where we live. And I don't mean the city of Longview, I mean our houses, our homes. Oftentimes, how nice someone's home is shows you how successful they are. Sometimes, we are so successful, we can earn enough to have more than one home. We can have a weekend home as well. We live in a place and in a society where we know that if we put more money and more time into our house to make our lives easier for ourselves, that shows everyone we can afford to do that. Well, if that is a culture that we live in, where someone's success is measured by the opulence of their home or homes, and yet we live in a culture where there are people who have no homes, there's probably something not quite right with that. So maybe not those little bitty idols shaped like gods, but maybe other things shaped like other symbols of things that are quite important to us. And then there's the one that we've probably all heard so many times about God who has given us a name, a holy name, who has entrusted us with a name. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not equip anyone who misuses his name. Now, the traditional understanding of these words is to not use God's name as a bad word, right? Don't use God's name to curse someone. Don't use it as a cuss word or a swear word. That's the traditional understanding of it. But there's a lot more to it than just that. See, God has given us God's name. We have been entrusted with God's name. And we have been entrusted with God's name to use it with reverence. To recognize how powerful it is. To recognize how great our God is. And to use that name casually and to toss it aside. Simple conversation. It's not really doing justice to that name. To use it in an exasperated tone, which we probably all do from time to time, is not doing justice to the severity of that name. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, Meemaw, who was quite possibly the most pious or religious person anyone has ever met. I mean, even though she lived just down the road from us, I remember going to sleep at night. She had made recordings of books for us to listen to. Like she was reading to us, on a tape as we went to sleep. But it wasn't just like a little book from the library. It was a book of the Bible. She read the Bible to us for us to go to sleep to. I remember one time she used the name Jesus in a bit of an exasperated tone. Oh, Jesus. The one time. And my mother quickly jumped on her and says, "Mother." And Meemaw looked at her and says, "Well, Judy Claire, you call on when you need it." We also sometimes use God's name falsely because we use God's name to support what we believe, whether or not that's what God believes. We use God's name to add merit and weight to something that may not have God's backing. Once upon a time, when I was in another presbytery in a different place, there was a minister coming into the presbytery. The minister was moving from the first church he had been called to the second church he had been called to. He had been at the first church 2.5 years. And when you come into a presbytery, you have to tell them a little bit about yourself. And he was telling us a little bit about that first call of his. And he said that while he was there, he shared with the congregation that he served that God had given him a vision for their next 5 years of ministry together. And yet he was leaving after 2.5 years. Do you think that was a part of the vision that God gave him for their next 5 years of ministry together? Probably not. We can all be guilty of using God to back up something that God may or may not be backing up. The Sabbath day. This one's really important. We're going to talk more about it next week. But for now, just realize that that Sabbath day means that there is a day that God has decreed shall be consecrated and blessed, a day of rest. We have a God who believes in a day of rest. So these first words, this first tablet, tells us about God. It tells us that this is a God who is before all other gods. A God who continues to free God's people. This is a God who deserves to be first and foremost of everything in our life, even though other things subtly sneak in from time to time. This is a God who has entrusted us with God's name. We have been blessed with the responsibility of God's holy name. That's what these first words tell us about who God is and who God is not. Now, of course, the real question is, why does any of that matter? Why does it matter that we need to know who God is or who God is not based upon these sacred words about our relationship with God? So, one of my favorite people to quote to prove to you just how smart I am is a guy named John Calvin. John Calvin is arguably one of the most influential theologians in the Reformed tradition. And Calvin used to say that we need to always have the law in front of us. Now, the law, that's what he calls the commandments, what we're calling the sacred words of God. He said we always need to have the law in front of us. And the law does many things when it's in front of us. One of the things the law does is the law tells us, reminds us of who God is. He says the law acts as a mirror to who God is. And so if we can understand the law, then we can understand God. And as Christians, it's important that we try to understand God. Not only is it important for us to try to understand God because this is who we worship, but because by knowing God, we can know ourselves too. Calvin says that before you can know yourself, you must know God. That's an age-old question, right? Regardless of whether or not you are a Christian, people are always asking ourselves, who am I? We cannot answer that question until we can answer the question, who is God? These sacred words of God tell us who God is. God who frees from slavery, a God who deserves to be first and foremost of everything in our life, a God who wants to be worshipped, a God who trusts us with the holy name. That is who God is. And if we can learn from the law who God is, then maybe we can learn who we are. Amen.